So, how do citizens actually get involved? Your textbook mentions various ways: marches, protest, participation, letter writing, but I am going to talk about voting, which is, I think, the aspect of participation that we're all most familiar with. It's one of the most fundamental, the most accessible, but I want to go a little bit deeper into the mechanism of voting. So, as I said, voting is the most fundamental form of participation. However, the United States, despite being one of the nation's oldest democracies, has remarkably low voter turnout. Participation rates in presidential election years is anywhere from 50 to 60%. It's much lower when you look at midterm and local elections. This is actually a pretty paradoxical observation, and I'm going to explain why. So, activists and political scientists often worry about remarkably low political participation rates, but an early political economist named Anthony Downs posited that actually participation rates are remarkably high. As a matter of fact, we ought to see zero participation when you consider the economics of voting. He came up with this equation for the utility of voting. U sub V is equal to P times B minus C, in which U of V is the utility that an individual gets from voting. P is the probability that the vote makes a difference in the election. B is the benefit one gets from voting. And C is the cost of the act of voting. Let me explain these terms a little bit further. The utility of voting, the benefit that you'll receive should the election go your way and your candidate wins. P is the probability that the vote will make a difference, pretty self-explanatory. The probability that if you show up, you can actually affect the outcome of the election. B, the benefit you get from voting, as I mentioned before, the probability that there will be policy outcomes that benefit you in a direct or indirect manner should your preferred candidate win. And you have to subtract the cost of voting. And by cost of voting, I mean you have to study up on the candidates. You have to figure out where your polling place is. You have to take time to drive to your polling place, stand in line, take time out of your regular day, and that can add up. And the reason why Anthony Downs found it so paradoxical that despite all this, we see people actually voting is because the likelihood of any one vote actually making the difference in a national election is remote in the extreme. The probability that your vote will make a difference is slim to none, even in local elections. And the cost of voting, taking time out of your day, studying up on the candidates, can take hours. And so sometimes the opportunity costs of taking time to research the candidates, the logistics of voting, etc., almost always outweighs the probability that your vote will make a difference or that your life will change much in a beneficial way, even if your preferred candidate wins. So, according to Anthony Downs, 50-60% participation rates are remarkably high. We ought to see zero. So, how do we account for this? Well, later on, two political scientists, Riker and Ordashuk, added what's called the D term. The utility of voting is equal to P times B minus C plus D. And D stands for one's sense of civic duty. We just have this innate feeling that as good American citizens, we need to contribute to the American body politic by participating in the voting process. Were they right? Well, that's still something that political scientists debate. Some view it as something that they were right to incorporate because Anthony Downs was looking too strictly at the economics and not enough at the sense of patriotism and civic pride that Americans hold that factor into their decision to vote. And others argue that it's a convenient catch-all, just a magical term that Riker and Ordashuk added into the equation in order to account for the paradoxical observation that this equation suggests that we should see 0 participation rates when in fact we see 50 to 60. To further complicate matters for Anthony Downs, Riker, and Ordashuk, consider that I told you that participation rates in local and midterm elections are much lower than in presidential elections. According to Anthony Downs, the probability that your vote will make a difference in the outcome of those types of elections is much higher than in a high turnout presidential election. I'm sure you've seen news stories where the results of local offices, local office elections, city council, school districts, came down to 1 vote. In an infamous example, a city council election was actually determined by coin toss. So in these types of elections, the probability that your vote will actually make a difference, which should increase the propensity to vote, does not seem to attract higher participation rates. They are much lower than in presidential elections, where one's ability to affect the outcome is much more diminished. So why do we observe this, despite the logic that it should be the reverse? Well, your guess is as good as mine. We'll get into some reasons later on in the course as to why participation rates might be higher, could be more media attention, more rigmarole about the election itself in presidential election years, but we'll discuss that further. However, that 50 to 60% participation rate is an overall average. There are a lot of disparities in the types of people that participate in elections. The biggest predictor of whether or not someone votes is actually their level of education. You all being college students and one day college degree holders will be much more likely to vote or to participate in some way than a person who has solely a high school level education. Lower socioeconomic status also leads to lower participation rates, and there are several reasons for this. One is that people who are of higher income might feel that they have a bigger stake in the outcomes of elections and therefore are more likely to vote. Could be simple economics, which by that I mean people who are of higher income are able to take more time out of their day to study up on candidates, to take the time to actually vote, whereas lower income citizens might not view the literal cost of voting, taking time off of work, taking time out of the day to go actually cast their ballot, to simply not be worth it. And all of these also align with racial disparities as well. There is some talk about disparities between white, African-American, and Latino voters. For a while, African-American participation was much lower than white voters. Then there's a debate as to whether or not they're actually about even when you control or consider income. Latino voters, however, regardless of how one controls for economic factors, have much lower participation rates. As a matter of fact, the lowest participation rates amongst any other racial demographic. And all of these are rooted in various historical and institutional biases, which we'll discuss in the coming weeks.